But we got to get to the task at hand, to this serious disaster. And I hope everybody listening to this is safe and secure. It has been a very difficult week for many of us as we've been looking out for loved ones, family, and our communities. I will say it has been so inspiring to see folks from around the country, and also, in their own communities showing up for people. The fact is that people are alive today because of mutual aid organizations that were performing necessary work, making sure that people were taken care of in Jesus Christ, not just this environmental, catastrophe, but this ongoing pandemic. So nothing but love and solidarity to those folks, and continue to support them, going forward.
And can
But
we should spell out exactly what kind of aid is needed. People are like going hungry severely, asking for
mhm,
food, right? Was that you that told me? Was it Christian and Chris that, you go outside and people like literally ask you for food and where you're
yes,
getting it?
well, it's food. I mean, you have to understand, obviously, for people who aren't familiar, just since we didn't spell it out, we are talking about what's going on in Texas right now, because the electric, system failed so many people, and because so many more houses, particularly newer houses and cheaper houses, are connected. Um, use electricity not just for powering their lights and things like that, but for heat and for cooking. Their ranges are electric. That meant that not only were people facing the cold, but a lot of people were having a difficult time providing food for themselves. I've heard stories from family members about neighbors who had been surviving on like crackers and cookies because they couldn't cook anything, right? They didn't have the opportunity to do that. So yeah, as Matt pointed out, like that mutual aid work was critical in providing basic, survival materials to people. And it's something that, like, I don't want to take away anything from the mutual aid, groups and the people who are doing that work, but it's something that the state should be doing. It's something that any kind of functional government would be able to provide for people. And the fact is that the government failed big time, just as the electrical system failed people across the state. And we'll get into that, in a little bit. But continue. People are going to continue to need help and aid going forward. We're seeing reports of empty grocery stores, things like that, right? Lines around the block to be able to get into those places, and then when you get inside, there's very little to purchase, right? So this has been a human crisis, right? A very serious ecological disaster that was only made worse by capitalist failure. And let's just paint the picture to everybody, right? Texas right now is in a state of disaster. As this winter storm hit the state, as temperatures plummeted, the electrical system failed. There were blackouts across the state as generators failed. And we'll get into the nonsense around that in a little bit, about how morons like Dan Crenshaw and Abbott and all these people are trying to make it, one, a war on renewables, but more bluntly, a culture war about the way that we produce our energy, right? But the fact is that the systems that produce electricity failed across the state as temperatures plummeted. Meanwhile, the price of natural gas skyrocketed. The storm would be bad enough on its own, right? Just because this is not a state that is prepared to, pave the roads and to provide all those kind of services that you typically have to do in a big winter storm like that, without the power outages. But just as we were just outlining, because of so many homes use electricity for their heating and for their cooking, it meant that millions of people had to face the cold with no power, and for so many as well, no water or ability to heat food up. I mean, this was a serious crisis, a serious catastrophe. And the sad reality is that people passed away because of this, right? Especially people who had to face these systems, the storm system, without access to housing. Again, thank you so much to all of the people who went out there and were doing the basic human thing of looking out for the less fortunate in the situation. But this was a crisis that hit people across the state, and it hit the most marginalized communities the worst,
Yeah, I
right?
mean, any power outage, like you have, like you said, people that are unhoused, but you also have anybody who's on any kind of medical
Hmm.
at home, right? At home care that has to wonder, okay, these are supposed to be rolling blackouts. Do I need to get the F out of here, or do I need to,
Hmm.
go someplace else, which is a huge issue. I know we're going to talk about ERCOT, or maybe we should actually let's. Do you want to move on to that now?
Yeah, I just wanted, and as Matt was saying too, it's like, also people with mobility issues. I mean,
Mm,
those are folks who are going to have a really difficult time, in this crisis as well. And yeah, I mean, the state government response has been extremely disappointing. It left people to have to look out for one another. And again, I'm just so moved by people's ability to do that. But it's something that we should have had, a state response to.
right.
It's completely unacceptable that the government was so extremely incompetent in this crisis. But here's the thing, this storm was expected to be bad. But just last week, ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, said that their system was prepared for the storm. It clearly was not. And I want to debunk one of the dumbest myths that has been put forward by, particularly by members of the Republican Party in the past few days, that it's because that, this crisis happened because the state is too reliant on renewables. And I know Matt has a bit prepared for this. I just wanted to also note that out of the total amount of power that suffered outages, wind only accounted for around 13%, which is a smaller amount by far than what happened, the outages that from coal plants, gas plants, and nuclear plants, right? All of those systems failed.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, to go on that, a couple things need to be said. First, about wind, it's true that certain windmills did freeze. The note that everyone is making about this is because they were ready for Texas climate. They weren't ready for a
Hmm.
polar vortex that might say be caused by climate change. So they didn't outfit that, and that's another market failure, right? Like, why would
Hmm.
you? Particularly if you don't believe in climate change. But if you're even just cutting corners, you're not expecting these things that are modeled at once every 100 years or whatever.
Hmm.
And yes, also, we'll get to it a little bit more in depth, but this is about capitalism and the and fracking, right? Like we
Hmm.
talk about like I mean fundamentally this is about the failure of gas infrastructure, literally liquids freezing in pipes and those having to all get shut down at the same time. Those are both that's a major issue beyond just the fossil fuel versus green energy thing, right? Because that there is problems with demand, right, that you're gonna have to get into. But you look like you want to say something.
Oh no, I was just going to say that. I mean, it's been such a joke to see the freak out about when, as Matt was saying, it was the natural gas pipelines that froze over,
Well, and
that caused a lot of the crisis.
and the reason why, I mean, that's preemptive, right? This is a preemptive propaganda campaign.
Hmm.
It's not just like they're stupid and look at these guys, they know their sides. Like fundamentally, there are people that know that a big like bet has been made or a big like a deal has been struck that really serves them.
Hmm.
And I mean, this has happened plenty of other times where green energy gets blamed for everything, but this is really market failure. This is deregulation. I'm going to put up this map now.
Yeah.
This is from, and is it Fred Stafford at Jacobin has a piece on this book, Shorting the Grid, that I
Mm.
pulled this from by, oh, here it is. And I'll put it up for you to, oh,
That's fine. I got it.
but anyway, yeah, so hold on, I need to put this down. And oh, here it is. Okay. I just want to make sure everybody sees this on the screen. And basically, you have different these different. So you have Texas, right? ERCOT. That's the one everyone's paying attention to, and it's like, oh, Texas doing their own thing. It's a very
Hmm.
Texan story, right? But fundamentally, they're not the only group. So what basically happened is in 1999, and I'm probably oversimplifying this massively, but from what I've garnered, previously you had utilities that were in charge of keeping the power on.
Hmm.
Then you have this energy deregulation, which I pulled these clips from, which wanted to open this up to have these sort of pools of transmitters and producers that, and it's entirely Reaganomics, right? This is all about instilling
Hmm.
competition and stuff like that. And so now there's nobody really responsible for making sure your lights stay on. It's like, I mean, these sorts of organizations are a little bit, right? But this is all it's all abdication of responsibility because it's better for profit seeking.
Hmm. Yeah, and like and that's why like I think it's important to hit this point to people that when you see Dan Crenshaw and these morons like Ted Cruz and Abbott and all of the other, the periphery, the folks from Colorado, right? All these new right-wing ghouls who want to tell this story about what happened here was a result of too much reliance on renewable energies. You need to be able to say that that's false, right? But it's also really important to not fall into the trap that they're laying for folks because they would prefer this to be a kind of culture war fight, right, where it's like people who are on the left are getting really they're focusing so much on the renewable energies, and proving that, oh, actually those didn't create as much of a crisis as natural gas and all that kind of stuff, and missing the fundamental thing that people like Crenshaw and Abbott and that moron Perry, who is the architect of the system, um, they want the conversation that they want to avoid, which is that this was a crisis that was made so much worse because of this fundamental belief in this free market ideology, right? That the markets in themselves are going to create better outcomes for people. And as Matt was pointing out, this is a problem across the country, right? Texas is an extreme example of it, but there has been this deregulation system across the country over the past few decades, which means that our infrastructure is extremely at risk everywhere, which is why you have to advocate for a Green New Deal and for a public takeover of these systems. Because if you leave it in the hands of private interests, you expose everybody.
Yes, I just want to jump in there because what do you always hear when it gets into this? It's like, well, actually, solar's becoming a lot more competitive on the market,
Hmm.
and it becomes this like market based thing. Well, I mean that this is the world we're living in, where guess what else is competitive, which is fracked gas, which is also
Yeah.
not good for reliability, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
and exactly. And like let's start to break down what this is. So it's like, look, there's the culture war thing, and I just like this is something I always want to, point out to people because this is how politics in this country is always mediated. And I know some people want me to get into some of the nasty comments that we've seen from like blue state liberals. I've just gone to a point with that where we have covered that enough on this show, at least for now, where if you just don't have the humanity to care about people who are suffering, I don't want to be sitting here and having to like advocate for you to see people as human beings, right? To advocate for you to care about other people. If you're that far gone, then at this point, I just don't have the strength of soul today to tell you why you should care about hungry and cold people, right? But let's talk about deregulation and what that means and why this market ideology exposed all these people to this tragedy, right? A typical electric system works like this, right? You have your generators, and then you have essentially like your power lines, which are regulated either by utilities, and then those go to consumers. In a and typically those are like vertically integrated, or those things are all sort of being done by one system. What has happened across the country, over the past few decades, has been a decoupling of those things, particularly an increase in privately owned electrical electricity generating assets, and then utilities that manage them, right, and then provide them to consumers. What the system is in Texas, not everywhere, right, because some places still maintain those kind of older, more traditional systems like Austin, San Marcos, um, right, and San Antonio, is a complete subjugation of that old system to this deregulated system, which means that there is just constant competition across the board, and a constant auction system. And what that has really meant, what that means technically for people today, is that there is a reliance on what is called just in time production. And that was the system that failed epically this week. Just in time production means,
including wind, we have to be honest. Like not
yes, no,
obviously to this extent that the fossil fuels did, but including wind.
no, 100%. Wind is a part of that system as well. Basically, private, owned organizations, private owned generators are producing electricity, and then they are trying to sell those to the buyers, right? Who end up being like the utility systems for different areas. And what that means is that it's a constant auction. And to win an auction, you want to be able to be offering the lowest price. And this is where the incentives of this system start to get really weak really quickly, right? So what happens when you're trying to push the lowest possible price for electricity is means that as a owner of those assets, you want to cut costs as much as possible. Well, what is one thing that would increase your costs? Well, that would be weatherizing your wind turbines or pipelines or whatever, um, to prevent against, a rare weather event in the state of Texas, right? And that is something that the market is not going to provide. And let me get this quote real quick here, because I think it actually describes it very well. This was described by the Houston Chronicle by Daniel Cohen, who is an engineering professor at Rice University, who described the Texas system as, to me, our system of electricity is like selling lottery tickets. And what he means by that is that typically these organizations are trying to sell, are selling their electricity and trying to undercut everyone else by lowering prices, and not investing in their infrastructure for these kind of catastrophic events. And then the payoff in these kind of systems, these rare events that you aren't going to invest to prepare for, is that in this kind of crisis moment, you are the sole provider. Because what happened across the state of Texas, as these generators started to fail across the state, is that the people who were still able to produce electricity and to sell electricity charged astronomical rates for them, right? That's what he means by lottery ticket.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just the people who are, generating the electricity, it's people who are still able to to provide like natural gas, right? So Jerry Jones, the owner of the Cowboys, his company made a bag. They made an incredible amount of money, right, from this system. As people were suffering, they were raking it in. Right. The point here is that this was not a system as much, as profitable as it is for people. And it should also be mentioned that, Texas is one of the largest electricity producing states in the country. Right. This was not a system that was prepared, to protect its capacity to do so in the future, to protect itself from this kind of event. And what happened in Texas was 100% an example of what happens when you lean into this system as much as possible, frankly. But across the country, we are seeing this failure to invest in this infrastructure portray itself as a massive problem for stability. An example of this would be PG&E in California. Their failure to protect and to invest in making sure that their infrastructure was up to date meant that they had pipelines explode, causing massive wildfires and death to people, right? This is something that we're going to be seeing much more of as our infrastructure, which has in this country, which has just completely become subservient to market logic, crumbles. Yeah. And the people who are profiting off of the system have very little incentive to prevent to do the kind of necessary social investment to prevent these kind of crises.
Yeah, we'll play a little bit more of this 1999 deregulation stuff in the post game, but I wanted to bring up this article from the time period, and it's from the Morning Call. It's from April 16th, 1999, and it's interesting to note who's quoted in the first few paragraphs. Mm. So. Clinton backs deregulation. Large power providers divided on how to promote nationwide measure. All right, let me just make it a little bit bigger so I can read it. The Clinton administration's plan for opening the $250 billion U.S. electricity market to competition got a lukewarm reception from many of the nation's largest power providers. The legislation made public Thursday aims for a January blah, blah, blah. Pennsylvania has already begun deregulating the state's power markets, that's another thing to stress is like, I do want to hit the Clinton administration, but also all the states were moving on this too. I wonder, I haven't looked at the makeup of the state legislatures, but I imagine there are plenty of corporate Democrats and Reagan Republicans. But Investor-owned utilities said the nationwide measure would give too much power to the Federal Energy Regulatory Committee. A rival to the utilities, energy selling Enron Corp, said the measure should set a firm mandate for the start of national deregulation. So Enron
Mm.
quoted as the pro-deregulation side of that. I mean, you couldn't have it any better. And I didn't even look. I didn't search Enron, right? I'd search Bill Clinton energy deregulation
Mm.
and Bill Richardson, who was Epstein related linked, who was Bill Clinton's energy secretary. But yeah, I mean that when Ted Cruz bashes California for power outages, it's the same market
It's
failures that's causing the stuff in Texas, right? So that's exactly the
exactly.
way to summarize this. Don't get caught in the red state, blue state bullshit.
Look, and I mean, like, don't get caught up in it, but understand that, like, Texas is an exceptional example of this because they went further than other places were willing to. But the point that I want people to understand, right, is this was a crisis that is a human made crisis, right? This is a crisis of ecological devastation, but the failure to be able to provide power to people was a crisis of capitalism. Right. And, the particularities of like the Texas example are important to understand, right? The fact that it is cut off from other states, those are important to understand. But it is equally critical for people to recognize that power production and power distribution are critical infrastructure in modern society. We see what the consequences are when those systems fail. And you need to start asking yourself and asking people in your community, asking people in your unions, asking people in your political organizations, if you think that you want these systems to be at the whim of private interests. Because when they are at the whim of private interests, everybody is at risk because they do not have the incentives to make sure that the public good is protected. They have every incentive to find a way to make as much money as possible. And that's why I brought up this quote from this, engineering professor earlier, right? Because this is somebody saying, like, within the system, it doesn't make sense for these organizations to weatherize their generators. And what that means is because those people don't want to take the financial hit, they are willing to put everybody at risk,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, what is the solution to all of this? I'll tell you one thing. Because everybody is so pissed about what happened, and rightfully so, we are going to see a very funny walk back from the Texas GOP. We are already seeing, Abbott and Crenshaw and all these characters act like they weren't a part of this system. What happened here? Oh, it must have been mismanagement. And like, look, ERCOT, is not a great organization, and there's been a big push and a focus on the fact that a lot of its board members aren't based in the state of Texas. Frankly, I agree with that, on a general point, but they're going to try to do that kind of culture war again to avoid the fundamental problem, which is this market ideology,
Yes.
right? And we need to like continue hitting that as hard as possible. But the second thing that they're going to start to do is they're going to say, okay, well, we need to do some more preparation for these systems. And what is very likely to happen is they are going to try to put that cost on people, on
Mm.
everyday people, right? Um, we cannot accept that. Wealthy people in this country and in the state of Texas have been making a lot of money over this past year, and they are flush enough to make sure that we can tax them and upgrade those systems as much as necessary. But we also need to go a step further than that and understand that the responsibility for providing power to us and the choices involved with that should be democratically controlled.
Yeah.
We need to put the public back in the idea of public utilities. We need a Green New Deal to address climate change, a just transition, unions to help lead that transition, and to provide the work that is necessary of updating our crumbling infrastructure across the country. And we need to be bringing these utilities under public control so that we can make the decisions about what things we want to use to provide power for ourselves and how resilient we want those systems to be. That's the conversation. That's the need. Don't let a bunch of morons distract you from that conversation because they are trying very
Right.
hard to do that.
Well, like Tucker Carlson he almost was laughing saying it, that like apparently the Green New Deal came to Texas and put up a whole bunch of windmills. No, it's capitalists that put up the
Mm-hmm.
windmill. And guess what? The capitalists that own the windmills aren't going to be incentivized to weatherize those either, just because they're like better versions of capitalists. Um,
Exactly.
And we have our buddies David and Jacob from the Valley Labor Report if we're ready.
I think we are. Yeah.
And just a quick pitch before we do that: patreon.com/leftreckoning, folks.